In this tutorial, we're going to basically go over how to use the different tools, such as the layer, fill, masking, projections, stencils, and brushes, as well as the eraser. For the most part, since we have our model loaded in here, let's go ahead and add a fill layer. So you have multiple different layers to add. So you have like a regular layer, similar to Photoshop, where you can just basically paint on whatever you need, adjust, erase, so on and so forth. But then you have a fill layer, similar to Photoshop as well, where you basically add in an entire fill. So with the fill layer, you're going to add in a coverall. So basically you go down into materials on the bottom left of your shelf, and what we're going to use is we're actually going to use a high gloss plastic. So what it's going to do is give a nice shimmer sheen, which also simulates metal or a painted metal. So at that point we can actually go through and see the nice shimmer sheen. But the fact of the matter is we don't want it to cover our entire model. So at that point, we actually need to add in what is known as a mask. What you're going to do is you're actually going to right-click on your fill layer and add a black mask. You'll notice that the entire material has disappeared. That's mostly because we need to bring in an actual masking, which would be white. So normally when you add in a material, you'll be on properties or paint. So in order to access your fill layer, you'll need to press 4 on your keyboard, but make sure that the mask is selected inside of your hierarchy. Then at that point, you have 4 different options to fill. So you can fill in via triangle. So you can just fill in one triangle at a time, if that's what you're aiming for. Or you can click in an entire quad at that point. So, or a polygon fill, sorry. And then at that point, you also have a mesh fill. So it's going to, when you do that, it fills in the entire asset as a whole, which works great if you're trying to do a base layer, because then at that point, all you have to do is, since everything is filled, now all you have to do is go into color, move it to black, and then select UV, which is a UV chunk fill, which however you unwrapped your asset, that UV is then selected by substance. So you can actually remove via UV or add via UV. Then at that point, we have technically filled in with a material everything outside of the actual light itself. And of course, blue is not like the color we're actually looking for. We're actually looking for something a little bit of an off-white or gray. So you can actually update this via fill layer to kind of get that projected look, because at that point you don't have to paint over anything. You can change it in real time. So as you go through and scale and look for the color you're looking, it makes it a whole lot easier to update if you do need to make changes in the future. So we're actually going to go about a mid-gray for this, and then just use it that way. The gloss itself is a little too glossy, so we're actually going to increase the roughness just about 0.2, right around there. So as we rotate, it actually seems more like a painted. Actually, let's kind of tune it down just a little bit, probably about a 0.15. And then at that point, we can actually get that nice little metal shimmer sheen to it. Of course, you can also increase the metallic to it, so you can give it more of a metal look or less of a metal finish. So it gives it that kind of variation as well. Also, as you work along, be sure to rename your layers. That way it's easier to keep track of as you progress. So this we're going to actually call the base bracket material. Alright, so at that point we know exactly what this is and how we need to change it. So we need to add another texture to the actual light itself. So we have different materials that we can choose from, but I have one already done. So at this point we can just add fill layer, and then we will select our material, which was turn signal, which was downloaded off of the Substance extension from the website, from Substance Share. And it's going to serve our purposes quite uniquely. But as it stands right now, it is not even remotely close to what we need. So of course we need to add another black mask, and then of course go back and select UV, but we also need to make sure it's white, and then select the UV that we want to add it to. Of course, it is still not the quite desired look that we're looking for, so we need to make adjustments to the material itself. So go ahead and click the material and just kind of play with it until it gets to where you need. If you don't want to add color, you can always click the material color, and you're just basically working via normal map, but in this case we kind of want to toy with it just a little bit. So we actually need a little bit more of a whitish gray, and we also want to bump this down to give it a little bit more of a roughness. And then also you have the option with your material to adjust the UV scale, as well as the offset and rotation. So if you don't want this to be perfectly square all the way down, the way that it is sitting right now, you can actually rotate it and change the scale. So we're gonna go right about, let's try 20. That's about right. Okay. And then at this point we've truncated it, and it actually looks a little bit more like a fluorescent light. Then, of course, to kind of build up a little bit of variation, like I was explaining, we actually want to rotate this, because this is actually how a lot of fluorescent lights are done. So we want to actually do about a 45-degree angle, so we get a diamond pattern overall on the material. This way it builds a little bit more of a variation, a little bit more of a unique look, and it's quite a bit more correct overall. Alright, so we can actually even tone down the normal intensity, is because you notice that this has got quite a bit going on. So we can actually adjust the normal intensity quite dramatically to where it's not as aggressive. Now you're just basically rolling off it at that point. We also don't want any metal, and we kind of want to add a little bit of a roughness to it as well. So with the roughness added, it's going to give it quite a bit of a change. And then let's go ahead and label this as the light cover, because this is actually covering the fluorescent lights on the inside of the asset itself. At this point, we've actually almost finished the entire texturing of this model, but we want to add a little bit more detail to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over adding in actual generators. So generators are basically procedurally generated textures for your asset. Since we already have our baking textures, what it's going to do is read the information from these textures and implement it via generator. So what we're going to do is want to add in a fill layer. And then what I usually use for like dirt and scuffs and things like that is actually plastic. So I use a plastic mat, which gives it a nice roughness overall. And then I actually leave it blue to kind of see over all the rest of everything that we're actually using. And I go ahead and add another black mask. And then right click again and go down to add generator. At this point, we have got it set up for a generator. And then over here on properties and generator, you will have a drop down of different kinds of generators. We want to go with an MG dirt to kind of build up a little bit of a shadow and dirt like it's been up there for a little bit of a while. You can actually work on this in real time as well. So you can actually adjust how much dirt you want in there, dirt contrast. Do you want it soft? Do you want it really, really hard kind of dirt, like it's really caked in there? We're going to go a little bit more of a dirt contrast to build that up. But you can also notice that the blue really helps is because you get that nice gradient, which will actually build up a lot of roughness as well. Since the contrast is there, we kind of want to pull it back a little bit, as well as the dirt level. We don't want to go too crazy. And then of course, if we want to change the color on how it looks, we can always do that in real time as well. I usually go with like an off gray to kind of like give it almost like a shadow, just to kind of build up a little bit of feeling to it. It works out pretty well for that. Oop. And okay, so that actually worked out pretty well. So usually when I add in a generator, I actually label that generator as what it actually is. So we're going to label that dirt. And let's go ahead and increase the roughness a little bit so it kind of fades into the rest of the actual asset itself. It's not super visible, but it still adds a little bit of a shadow and breaks up that high contrast between your textures. This is one reason why I like to use it. And let's see, what else do we have? We also have projections. So projections are actually going to be something that you project onto your asset as a whole. So let's see, let's do this. If we wanted to do a stencil, we would just add a new layer, similar to Photoshop, since that layer is there. One thing that I like to do is actually go into my UV textures, and what you would actually see here is, let's get rid of that, and your material mode or stencil. Either or works, but material mode has a little bit more options than stencil. Stencil, you actually want to go and drag your alpha into the stencil or whatever you're trying to achieve, or even if you want to do a reverse pattern or anything like that. Let's see, something like this. So say if we wanted to add in almost like a gating on this, you can do that. You can add in normals to it, so on and so forth. And it just kind of paints in due to your masks and all kinds of stuff. To adjust the stencil, you would actually hold down S and right click to kind of scale up and down as you move the mouse, or if you need to rotate it, left click and rotate it up and down, and that way you can do it that way. But in this case, we're not using stencils for anything really. And that's actually, this is pretty much the way that I want it. So what we're going to do is actually add in normals. So we're going to go into normals, and with this layer, I'm actually going to label it normals, and we're going to paint in normals. So we're going to use alphas or hard surfaces, but in this case, we're going to use hard surfaces, and we're going to use the presets of screws for details around here. So what we're going to do is you're going to take your hard surfaces off of your shelf, select the screw that you want. In this case, we're going to use, let's use a Phillips, and then we're going to just add it into normals, and we're going to need to make sure that our alpha is set up accordingly. Hardness is set to 0, so if we click on the thing, it's going to project a normal right on the map, but that is a bit too big. Same in Photoshop. If you use your bracket keys, it is going to do this, which is a little bit, we're just pumping nipples on this thing, so we're actually going to change that as well, which a lot of this can actually be changed via hardness as well. If you increase the hardness, it just bumps it up, and You just kind of have to toy with it to kind of look for what you're looking for. In this case, the height is a normal on top of a normal. We actually want this to, oh, that was a righteous click. I just clicked on 0 and it worked great. So now with the normal set to 0, we're actually pumping in normals at this rate, so we're actually being able to project the screws in there relatively simple. Of course, the smaller you make your brush, the more pixelated it becomes, is because it's trying to transfer all that data into one spot. So in this case, we are actually going to go into this mode. And if we're going to add screws, we're going to go ahead. We're only going to do a few or a couple. So we might add one here. Here, and here. Okay. So now you can kind of see that they've been put in there, so it builds up, it breaks up the variation a little bit, so you can actually, come on. So it gives it a little bit more character, which is always nice. But if you want to add a little bit more detail, you can always add in other kinds of normals as well, similar to like clips or things like that, which you can more easily do than not. So if you want to add in more of those, you can actually either add it with color or without color, just by adding in the material sections here. So if we're going to add in a couple like little notches or anything inside of this as well. So we're actually, I have a brush already that I've used several times. Let's see, what did I do with it? Oh, it's not in here. So, okay, so what we'll do is, in this case, we'll actually just, we'll just do this. Actually, no. This is what we're going to do. We're actually going to create indents across here to kind of build up a variation. So with the height, I actually drop it down because I like to make little dimples and dents and stuff to kind of break up the miscellaneous stuff. And I actually increase the hardness all the way up. And boop. Oh, I forgot to remove the normal. Cool effect. You can always stack them, but in this case we don't want to. And then just a simple little indentation. And in that case, now it's got way more character and it actually looks like it's been machined. And it'll look the same on the other side. I'm not going to flip that all the way around or anything like that. It's just simple little touches and goes with normal maps inside of here. If you did want to inset a color, you can always click color, change the color. So you wanted to add a red one or anything like that, you can click red and it would make it red. But in this case, we just want to basically fold the metal in, and that's just about it. But for the most part, this will actually conclude the tutorial on textures and the tools used to create the textures.